Once, long ago, as all tales are long ago for the young, in a far-off city, because all cities are far off in any good tale, there lived a Mensch named Abe. He had lived in the city from birth. In fact, he still lived in the very house he grew up in. Now, to call it a house is an exaggeration. He lived in an apartment fashioned with 6 other apartments from a house built at the beginning of the last century. When Abe was born, the whole neighborhood was Jewish and remained so until the city caught up to it. Slowly, the delicatessens became Chinese restaurants or barbecued ribs, Southern style, or maybe a little coffee shop that served fresh donuts sprinkled with sugar or, well, you get the idea. Through the transition, Abe was always the stalwart neighbor. He helped Mrs. Chan move that amazingly heavy piano to her flat, even though she did not play a single note. He had never driven a car, but he handed Mohammed, the mechanic, his tools and as he tried to fix the neighborhood cars. Abe went daily to his little tailor shop, never making condemning noises at the threadbare clothes brought in him to repair or a late payment made for that new suit for a wedding. He loved best sitting and sewing on his front stoop so he could talk to all who passed by. He even listened patiently to the long rambling stories of Crazy Al, one of the more seedy residents of the community. Every day at 1:30, Abe closed his shop and walked down the street to Ma Wong's kosher chicken Chinese noodles for lunch. Jim the cook had come when the neighborhood was mostly Jewish. He had come up with the most succulent noodle dish made kosher for his Jewish patrons. His noodles were famous, and Abe his oldest and most loyal customer. Due to his status, Abe was taken to his accustomed seat in the front booth where he could look out on the street while eating his lunch. He always left a tip. For dessert, Abe walked down to the coffee shop for a cup of the House and Holes. His favorite was donut holes dipped in chocolate and crunchy inside. Abe had never left the neighborhood more than 3 or 4 times in his whole life. He watched the neighborhood change, slowly become poorer, more discouraged. He felt the pain of his neighbors. All agreed he was a true Mensch. Now, the year we are concerned with was a particularly hard one. The economy was in the dumps and winter had come early with biting chill winds. Abe had been very busy trying to make old coats last another winter and old pants another month. He watched the shivering kids at the bus stop and wished he could do something. Abe was still watching the street when the recycle truck went by. Sticking out of the corner of a bin was an old sleeping bag. He remembered that pile of surplus wool blankets and sleeping bags he had seen in the basement of Mort's junk shop. With sudden inspiration, Abe closed his shop, ran to Mort's, and burst in the door, spraying snow everywhere. He headed straight down to the basement corner. Mort followed him, yelling in an agitated manner. Abe picked up one of the blankets. It had holes in numerous places. He picked up one of the sleeping bags, and it was barely better. Wheeling on Mort, he demanded the cost. It just happened that Mort had seen the same recycle truck and had decided to get rid of that musty old pile of blankets Abe was so interested in. He promptly gave them to Abe, smiling while thinking of the work he had saved himself. Beaming, Abe picked up the first pile and left, promising to come back later for the rest. He hurried down to his shop and threw the first batch into the washer. It took 4 trips to bring all the materials to his shop. Abe worked long into the night. Early the next day, he was back at it, and so on for 3 days until he cleaned every blanket and sleeping bag. After he cut them into usable pieces, the real work began. He was going to make as many warm coats as he could for the kids at the bus stop. Abe had been a tailor for so long, his eyes measured what his measuring tape would only confirm. Every day he would measure another kid with his eyes. He would then cut, shape, and sew a new coat. He used 40 years of scraps to cover the warm linings he had made from the blankets and sleeping bags to create coats with wonderful, colorful designs. He made coats with large pockets for those who liked to carry everything around with them, and small hidden pockets for secret and special things. He made slit pockets to warm the hands of those without gloves. He put lightning zags and sunbursts, rainbows and fish, stiff gold collars to protect the neck from the wind, and fringe to flap as feathers. Each coat had something special for the child he made it for, and each was very, very warm. As Abe sewed, he thought about the problem of how to give coats away without offending anyone. Abe knew about pride and how some people do foolish things like refusing warm coats. He was still thinking when city crews came by and hung the neighborhood's singular Christmas ornament on the lamppost across the street. He was still thinking when he noticed Thelma at the barbecue place was putting up her Kwanzaa decorations. The next morning, he was still thinking when Jim brought him a special Chinese cake baked as a Christmas present. Abe placed the small sweet cake sprinkled with fine chopped nuts onto his Hanukkah table and turned to Jim grinning. Then he asked Jim if he was a Christian. When Jim told him he was a Buddhist, Abe started laughing joyfully. When he was finally able to tell Jim what he was laughing about, Jim started laughing too. You see, a Buddhist had given a Jew a Christmas present, and both thought it a great thing indeed. After their visit, Abe was hardly able to contain himself. He didn't open his shop that afternoon. Instead, he got on the city bus and went downtown, where he spent the money he'd been saving for a trip to Florida. He went from one store to another, buying a little something here and a bunch of that stuff there. When he got on the bus to go home, he could hardly manage the packages. He sat in the front of the bus, chuckling at everyone and no one at all, as he patted his packages with a conspiratorial twinkle in his eyes and an aria in his heart. 2 days before Christmas, Abe had finished all the coats. He was very busy making packages out of old funny papers and fancy ribbon. He worked long into the night, making those special somethings he planned to leave for all. By Christmas, he was almost ready. It was late when Abe walked down the street to the wooden slat box that served Crazy Al as a home. He knocked politely and waited to be asked in. When he had seated himself in the box, he handed Crazy Al a takeout from Ma Wong's along with a large sweet tea and cake that Jim sent along after Abe told him he was taking dinner to Crazy Al. Crazy Al was very pleased with his hot dinner and started eating hungrily as Abe told him why he'd come. He became quiet for a few moments and then stuck out his hand, thanking Abe for thinking of him that night. They shook hands solemnly. When Crazy Al had finished eating, they left for Abe's shop. They carefully put the packages in Crazy Al's shopping cart, then cautiously and quietly secreted Abe's bundles to each apartment building. They placed a package in front of each door and tied a brightly twinkling bell with a red velvet ribbon to each doorknob. They knew that when the door was opened, the bell would ring out its joyful song. In the wee hours, they finally finished and went to Abe's shop, where they ate a hearty breakfast looking out the window at the sun on the snow in the street. Suddenly, from out of the apartment doors across the street, children came dancing out wearing their beautiful multicolored coats, sucking candy canes and throwing into the air the huge fresh oranges they had found on their packages. Soon the street filled with Abe's neighbors, ringing the shiny new bells on velvet ribbons for the joy of their sound as they watched the kids in their new coats. Crazy Al stood at the window with tears running down his dirty face into his beard. He had never been so happy. Abe stood beside him, smiling softly. He felt warm inside, as warm as the kids in their new coats. as warm as a trip to Florida, and after all, he never really wanted to leave his neighborhood. That evening, as he ate a delicious dinner with Mrs. Chan and her family, he listened to the talk. No one let on if they guessed it was he who had transformed the neighborhood with his coats. All agreed that it was the most wondrous thing. And when Mrs. Chan's granddaughter played Handel on the piano, Abe knew all was well. Later, when the kids had gone back to school, he discovered that his coat started a new fad and everyone in all the neighborhoods wanted one. As one of the few tailors left in the city, he was busy all the rest of the winter sewing beautiful coats. In fact, he sewed so many warm coats that winter that he made enough money to go on his trip to Florida. He was glad, though, when his holiday ended and he could come home to his neighborhood, the one he had lived in his whole life.